You tell yourself not to think about them. You delete the photos. You put the phone in another room. You promise yourself today is the day you finally stop replaying every memory. And within minutes, sometimes seconds, their face is back in your mind anyway, sharper than before, as if your own thoughts are working against you. You did not fail because you are weak. You failed because of exactly how your mind handles instructions like that one. Now, let us actually think about what that means. To understand why trying not to think about someone often backfires, you need to understand how the mind actually processes the instruction to suppress a thought. Suppression sounds simple on the surface. Do not think about something and it should disappear. But the mind does not work like a light switch you can simply flip off. Thinking involves a search process, and searching requires knowing what you are looking for, which means the very act of trying not to think about someone requires briefly checking whether that person is present in your mind in the first place. This idea was studied directly by psychologist Daniel Wegner in a well-known series of experiments often called the White Bear Studies. Participants were asked to spend several minutes trying not to think about a white bear while ringing a small bell every time the thought crossed their mind anyway. Almost every participant struggled. The white bear kept appearing again and again, despite deliberate effort to keep it out of awareness. What made the findings even more striking came afterward, when participants were then told they could think about the white bear freely. Many reported an intense rebound, thinking about the white bear even more than a separate group who had never been told to suppress it at all. Wegner proposed an explanation for this pattern, known as ironic process theory. According to this idea, the mind runs two separate mental processes at once whenever you try to suppress a thought. One process actively searches for something else to occupy your attention, distraction, a new topic, a different train of thought. A second process runs quietly in the background, constantly checking whether the unwanted thought has returned, because monitoring is required to catch it and push it back out. That monitoring process cannot function without keeping the very thought you're trying to avoid faintly active. In trying to guard the door, part of your mind has to keep glancing at what it is guarding against. Under normal conditions, this monitoring process usually stays quiet enough in the background that suppression can work reasonably well for a short period. The trouble begins when mental resources become limited. Stress, fatigue, emotional intensity, and competing demands on attention all reduce your capacity to keep the distraction process running strongly. When that happens, the monitoring process becomes the dominant one, and instead of successfully pushing the thought away, your mind ends up highlighting it instead. This helps explain why thoughts about someone you're trying to forget often surge specifically during moments of tiredness, stress, or emotional vulnerability, precisely when your mental resources for active distraction are running lowest. There is another layer to this that makes the experience feel even more persistent, connected to how emotional significance affects memory and attention. The brain doesn't treat all information equally. Emotionally significant experiences, especially ones tied to attachment, loss, or unresolved feelings, tend to receive heightened priority in memory and attention systems. This is sometimes described in terms of emotional salience, meaning how strongly something stands out and demands cognitive resources compared to more neutral information. A person you have strong feelings about, whether from love, heartbreak, or unresolved conflict, is inherently more emotionally salient than a random white bear in a laboratory experiment. This means the ironic rebound effect tends to be even stronger and more persistent when the suppressed thought involves someone emotionally significant compared to a neutral, arbitrary image. It's worth being clear here that thought suppression research shows some nuance here, since not every study finds the exact same strength of rebound effect. Some experiments find ironic rebounds are more reliable under high mental load or emotional stress, while under calmer, well-rested conditions, some individuals manage suppression somewhat more successfully without an obvious rebound. Individual differences also play a role. People who tend toward higher anxiety or rumination generally show stronger ironic effects, likely because their baseline monitoring processes are already more active and vigilant even before deliberate suppression begins. There is another related concept worth understanding here, connected to what psychologists call rumination. Rumination refers to repetitive, circular thinking about a distressing topic, often replaying the same questions or memories without reaching resolution.
Unlike simple remembering, rumination tends to involve asking the same unanswerable questions over and over, wondering what went wrong, what could have been different, or what the other person is thinking now, without ever arriving at a satisfying answer. Suppression and rumination can end up reinforcing each other in an unfortunate loop. Trying to suppress a painful thought about someone can trigger the ironic monitoring process, which increases how often the thought intrudes, which then invites rumination as the mind tries to process and make sense of why the thought keeps returning, which in turn increases the emotional salience of the memory, making future suppression attempts even less effective than before. There's one more piece worth understanding here, connected to how the brain forms associations with a person and the surrounding environment. When someone becomes emotionally significant, the mind doesn't store memories of them in isolation. Instead, it links that person to songs, locations, routines, and even unrelated objects present during meaningful moments together. This means that trying to forget someone rarely involves suppressing a single thought. It usually involves suppressing dozens of smaller associative triggers scattered throughout daily life, a particular street corner, a certain time of day, a song that plays unexpectedly on the radio. Each trigger can independently reactivate the very thought you're trying to avoid, which helps explain why forgetting someone often feels less like closing one door and more like trying to close many doors scattered across an entire house, some of which you didn't even know existed until they suddenly opened. So now put both of these processes together, the ironic monitoring effect and the heightened emotional salience of meaningful relationships, and you get a clearer picture of why trying to forget someone specific can feel so much harder than forgetting anything else in daily life. It's not simply that you care more about this person than a stranger would, although that's certainly part of it. It's that the very act of trying to force the thought away activates a background monitoring system that requires keeping that person faintly present in your mind in order to keep checking for them, while the emotional significance of the relationship gives that thought extra priority for attention and memory in the first place. These two processes don't just add together, they actively feed each other, since increased intrusion strengthens emotional salience, and heightened emotional salience makes each intrusion harder to dismiss quickly, creating a loop that can feel completely outside of conscious control. Understanding this mechanism doesn't make the feelings disappear, but it does change what the experience actually means about you. Persistent thoughts about someone you're trying to forget aren't proof that you're unable to move on, and they're not evidence that your feelings are somehow stronger or more real than anyone else's. They reflect a well-documented pattern in how attention and suppression interact under emotional load. Recognizing this can also change your approach. Psychological research on thought management suggests that direct suppression tends to be less effective than allowing a thought to surface briefly, acknowledging it without judgment, and then gently redirecting attention rather than fighting to block it outright. Consistent, structured distraction through meaningful activity, rather than a rigid effort to erase the thought entirely, tends to reduce the ironic rebound effect over time far more reliably than sheer willpower alone. It also helps to recognize that this pattern is temporary in nature rather than permanent, even though it rarely feels that way in the moment. As emotional intensity around an experience naturally decreases with time and new experiences accumulate, the salience of that specific memory typically declines as well, requiring less active suppression and therefore triggering fewer ironic rebounds. The mind is not broken when this happens to you. It's simply following a well-established pattern that anyone with a functioning attention system experiences under similar emotional conditions. The next time a thought about someone resurfaces exactly when you're trying hardest to push it away, remember that your mind was never working against you in the way it felt. It was doing precisely what you asked, quietly standing guard at a door you told never to open.